There's a profound truth that courts, particularly in America, are built to uphold. The law is a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the powerful. And on this particular morning, a wealthy landlord learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Richard Vance was the embodiment of privilege. A man who owned over 40 rental properties in this city, he had a presence that filled the courtroom even before he spoke. At 6'1", with silver hair slicked back with precision, he stood there in a custom-tailored charcoal suit worth more than most people's monthly rent. A solid gold Rolex gleamed on his wrist, catching the light in such a way that it almost seemed to mock the people around him. His shoes, polished to perfection, gleamed like mirrors. The scent of wealth and power was thick around him. But here's the thing about arrogance. It blinds you. It makes you forget that your wealth doesn't give you the right to trample over people's lives. And Richard Vance had made one massive mistake that morning. He underestimated the law and what this courtroom stood for. Before him sat Eleanor Higgins, a 72-year-old widow. She had walked 3 miles in the freezing drizzle to attend the court hearing. Her coat, once a deep navy, was now frayed at the elbows, the fabric worn down by years of hard work and sacrifice. She had raised children, nursed the sick, and lived a lifetime of struggles. But in the eyes of Vance, she was just another tenant, one he could easily push out without a second thought. Eleanor wasn't a threat. She wasn't a villain. She was a woman who had paid her rent on time for 11 years. 11 years of being a good tenant, never once causing trouble. But on this day, she was at risk of losing everything, all because of a single late rent payment. And that's where Richard Vance's arrogance would finally catch up with him. The reason for the eviction? A missed payment. Just 24 hours late. A technicality that Vance believed gave him the right to throw her out on the street. But what he didn't know was that Eleanor's story wasn't just about money. It was about a system that had been rigged to favor the rich and crush those who were already struggling. I glanced down at the case file. The eviction was for an $850 rent payment with an additional $300 in expedited late fees and penalties. I looked up at Vance and asked calmly, "Mr. Vance, according to the documents you've filed, Mrs. Higgins has lived in your building for over a decade. She has never missed a payment or caused any issues, and yet you are trying to evict her over a single late payment?" He didn't flinch. Not even a little. He leaned casually on the podium, tapping a Mont Blanc pen against his documents, his face utterly impassive. "Your Honor, I run a business, not a charity. The lease is clear. Rent is due on the 1st of the month, and she failed to pay on time. I am well within my rights to file for eviction." I turned to Eleanor. Her voice, though soft, was steady. "Your Honor, my pension is deposited on the 31st, but this month the bank held the deposit due to the federal holiday. I went to Mr. Vance's office the very next morning with the full payment, but they refused to accept it. I was told I had to pay an additional $300 or I would be evicted." I looked at Vance. His indifference was chilling. He didn't care. To him, Eleanor was nothing more than a problem he needed to solve with his wealth and power. "Mr. Vance," I said, keeping my tone measured, "you refused her payment? A payment that was delayed due to a federal holiday? A 72-year-old woman who walked to your office to make the payment as soon as the funds were available." His response was cold. "The contract is clear. If I make an exception for her, I have to make exceptions for everyone. I'm not in the business of making exceptions." I took a deep breath, looking down at the case file again, but this time I wasn't looking at the rent documents. I was looking at the bigger picture, the one that Vance had chosen to ignore. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice steady but firm, "you're so focused on enforcing this contract, but what about your own obligations under that same contract?" I turned the page, revealing another clause. Section 8, Paragraph A. It states that you must maintain the apartment in a habitable condition, especially when it comes to heating. Mrs. Higgins has lived without proper heat for months. How is that acceptable? Eleanor's hands trembled as she spoke again, her voice small but resolute. "The heat hasn't worked since November, Your Honor. I've been using a space heater to survive the cold. I called the office 3 times, but they told me they were waiting for parts." The room was silent for a moment. The weight of her words hung in the air, and still Vance didn't budge. That's not relevant, he said, his tone defensive. I leaned forward, staring directly at him. It's highly relevant, Mr. Vance. You've ignored the very basic needs of your tenant, leaving her to survive a brutal winter with a makeshift space heater. And now, because she was 16 hours late on her rent due to a bank holiday, you want to throw her out? The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The tension was palpable. I wasn't just fighting for one woman's home. I was fighting for what was right. For the people who work hard, who struggle, and who get crushed by a system that's supposed to protect them but often does the opposite. Vance's arrogance was starting to crack. He tried to hide it, but I could see it in his eyes. The confidence that had carried him through his life was beginning to waver. I don't see how this is relevant, Your Honor, he muttered, but his voice lacked the power it once had. I didn't hesitate. I turned to my clerk. Contact the City Housing Authority. I'm ordering a full inspection of this building, every unit, now. The shift in the room was immediate. Vance's attorney stood up, his face pale. Your Honor, please, he said, trying to calm the situation, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted. The law was now on Mrs. Higgins's side. Mr. Vance, I said, looking at him one last time, you came in here demanding strict adherence to the law. Well, I'm going to give you exactly what you asked for, but not the way you think. I could see the panic rising in his chest. Vance's arrogance had turned to fear. He wasn't in control anymore. He was no longer the powerful man with the gold watch and custom suit. He was a man on the verge of losing everything. The housing inspection was ordered. The fines, the violations, and the damage to Vance's reputation were inevitable. He was no longer untouchable. But for Eleanor, the moment had arrived. She had fought for her home, for her dignity, and in that courtroom she had won. As I dismissed the case, I couldn't help but say, Mr. Vance, you've made it very clear that you think you're above the law, but today you've learned that the law is not your weapon. It's a shield for those who need it the most. And with those words, the curtain fell on Richard Vance's arrogance, and justice had finally been served.